From the moment Bruce Wayne donned the cape and cowl as Batman, the cast of criminals known as the Rogues Gallery has provided the Dark Knight with some of the most legendary confrontations in comics history. In the beginning, there was the Joker, a victim of a chemical waste accident which stretched his face into a hideous grin. He vowed to terrify honest citizens in the same way Batman struck fear into criminals. The Joker became the model for other Batman villains to follow. A seemingly endless parade of tormented, insatiable lunatics who would sacrifice anything to earn a place in Gotham City's underworld. Catwoman, the femme fatale alter ego of a jet-set socialite. She stalks the fortunes of Gotham's idle and corrupt rich. Harley Quinn, a former psychologist who became personally involved with her patient, the Joker, a disturbing mixture of comedy and tragedy. Two-Face, hinging every decision on the flip of a silver dollar. His unpredictability makes him one of Batman's most dangerous enemies. Scarecrow, sadistic, analytical, and precise. This master manipulator will find his target's greatest fear and exploit it mercilessly. The Penguin, shunned by high society for his bird-like appearance, he is the portrait of aristocracy gone mad. Clayface, permanently altered by an experimental chemical force-fed to him by mobsters, once handsome movie star Matt Hagen now revenges himself on the world as a shape-shifting monster. Ra's al Ghul, a centuries-old mystic who found eternal life in the Lazarus pit, only to discover the byproduct of his immortality was insanity. Bane, a deadly South American hitman hired by a gang boss to kill Batman. This masked assassin uses a super steroid called Venom to enhance his already massive physique and power. Poison Ivy, lovelier than a rose, and deadlier than Nightshade. Her unique body chemistry can enslave any man, and her kisses are fatally toxic. The Riddler, a constant frustration to the Caped Crusader. He's a creature of cold intellect and sardonic wit, with a penchant for committing brain-racking crimes. Mr. Freeze, sworn to make Batman suffer for interfering in his plans for revenge, he encases himself in a Sub-Zero power suit and wields a gun capable of freezing its target to death. Killer Croc, a mutant reptile man who worked as a freak show attraction and professional wrestler until he took up the life of a Gotham City crime boss. He embodies cruelty, tenacity, and sheer animal rage. And now, the latest foe to rise against Batman and Gotham City. Sin Tzu, deadly master of the arts of war. But who is this mysterious villain? And from what shadowy den did he emerge?
Our challenge going in was to make a good, a new villain, a good new villain for the Batman universe. And yeah, and we realized we needed a very different kind of villain, because Batman, if you look at the rogues gallery for Batman, he doesn't have a big, what I call an ambient villain. An ambient villain would be like Blofeld in the James Bond series, or like the Emperor in Star Wars. You know, one of those guys that controls thousands of minions. Batman doesn't really have one. And we said, no, let's have a guy that's squaring off against Batman, and he wants to conquer Gotham City.
Basically, we knew that we wanted somebody to challenge Batman, both physically and mentally. We wanted somebody to really stand toe-to-toe with him, to challenge Batman on all fronts. And he had to be brilliant. He had to be physically really strong, powerful, and he really had to pose a really serious threat to Batman.
Yeah, once we knew that the whole character establishment thing is, first you decide what he's going to do, then we decided what his basic personality was. Then I talked to Jim Lee, because that was the right time to bring him in.
I think in games like Batman, where there's an established rogues gallery, you want to entice the players to try, you know, to pick up the game, and I think the idea was to introduce a new character. You need people to create the characters, so they approached Flint Dilley and myself. Flint wrote the game, the script for the video game, and I've worked in comics for almost my entire life, and he and I collaborated and came up with the character Sin Tzu. We just sort of brainstormed, and a lot of times, in the same way in comics, you often start with a name. Like, a name is crucial. A name can give you the powers, it can give you suggestions for visuals, it can give you an immediate, you know, it can write itself. If you have a cool name, you know everything about the character from the start. And so we sort of brainstormed about what this character would be.
And Jim Lee and I got together, and I had all these ideas and you know, notions about the character, but I had no idea what he looked like or anything like that. So we just started talking about the character and what he did and all this, and they said, you know, we want somebody that's like a general but a major strategist, because we want to play on a whole part of Batman's nature that we know is there, but we haven't really ever seen. We thought, well, he'd be like Sun Tzu, but we'll call him Sin Tzu because this is Batman. And we were off and running.
And in this game, this particular villain needed to be more of a strategic villain. He'd be a guy that sort of masterminded this grand plot against Batman. And so when we started talking about those kinds of characters, people like that, I mentioned something about Sun Tzu, the Art of War. It's a, you know, well-known book about warfare and how to conduct it, and that sparked the idea of creating a character called Sin Tzu. And immediately we knew the character was Asian. We knew, you know, kind of that he was militaristic, and so that kind of gives you a starting point for a visual. You start thinking about military outfits, uniforms, that kind of thing, and that's what really kind of got it. Sort of, you need that spark to kind of, you know, start the process, and then it makes everything else fall into place.
You know, this guy really thinks of himself as a general, and he really thinks of himself as a conqueror. And everything he says, and you know, we're turning the game script into a novel now, and everything he says in the game script and the novel sort of sounds like Sun Tzu, and it sort of sounds like legitimate, you know, advice in warfare, except it's so twisted and evil that it has a kind of nice edge to it.
Two great commanders facing each other on an empty battlefield.
But I think the idea is that Sin Tzu is a character that's you know, hell-bent on getting revenge on Batman, and he's a character that has masterminded this plot and thought it all through, and has really maneuvered Batman into this spot. And it's not just physically, but also psychologically, and I think that is a hallmark of a Batman villain. Sin Tzu went through a lot of different permutations before we got to a final version. We knew, because of the name and because of his function in the game, that he would be an Asian character that had militaristic, sort of strategic thinking in mind. And when we start thinking about Asian culture, whether it's Japan, China, there are a lot of visual things you can play around with. Tattoos, a very prominent thing within Japan, kind of a long ponytail kind of thing. The fact that the Chinese put a lot of value on gold and gold leaf patterns.
You know, he painted all of his skin gold because he's got to, you know, harness this psychic energy, which is what, you know, controls all of his powers, and so you can't let it out of the body. It can only come out through his eyes or through his mouth, or and you start figuring things out, and that starts affecting what the guy looks like. And after that, Jim started drawing up ideas, and I wrote character studies, and they kept going back and forth, and then they'd go over to Ubi Soft, who would be talking about what they needed for the purposes of the 3D animation and the characters.
And then the game developers use that as a framework for creating a three-dimensional polygonal virtual character, I guess, and they insert that into the game. And it's kind of a surprise for people that have been following Batman comics, because it's a brand new character, and it allows the game developers to really custom make the game to their vision. They're not necessarily locked into using something that already exists. They can approach a writer and an artist like myself and say, look, this is kind of what we're looking for. Can you help us out on this, and come up with something that works best in a 3D video game format.
And sure enough, when we got done, we knew, hey, we've got a great character here. So that's how that was Sin Tzu's birth and or his conception and birth.
In the beginning, there was actually no plan to create Sin Tzu, and the Joker was set to be the lead villain in the game. Then the decision was made to use another character because, although the Joker is a fascinating character, we see him so often in games that it was beginning to become routine.
But still, there was something else that we could add to this product to spice it out a little. And when DC came with the idea of creating a new character, it sounded perfect.
A couple weeks later, we heard that Jim Lee was on board, and this thing was being really backed, and we were really putting the resources needed to make this happen. And we realized that we were onto something big here, something special.
Creating the character was the second part of this whole project, because it was a project within the project. We're creating this game, we're producing and designing the game, but inside this there was this character that needed to be designed. We started with his visual, with his colors, his shape, and then working out some animation.
The character creation process began once we received concept art from both Jim Lee and DC Comics. While Jim Lee's style was very realistic, the art from DC was closer to the cartoonish style of Bruce Timm, the artist from Batman the Animated Series. At that point, we were able to really get going on the 3D Sin Tzu. Our in-house 2D artist Olivier got to work on creating more character illustrations that we could use as reference. We needed as many of these sketches as possible, since all we had to go on were those two initial sketches from Jim Lee and DC. For all the other characters you see, we had the entire animated series to use as reference. So we had a lot of catching up to do with Sin Tzu. These 2D sketches were critical for us to better understand the Sin Tzu character and capture his essence. My part started after we received the sketches from Jim Lee. It was my job to take those sketches and tweak them so we could have something applicable to the game, something the 3D artists could take into their arena and use to create a working character model. And most of all, I had to come up with a look that would fit naturally with the style we had already established for the other characters in the game. Jim Lee's initial sketches of Sin Tzu had rather complicated facial designs, especially around the eyes. He had these arabesque style tattoos that were filled with complex circles, loops, spirals, and so on. These were really interesting, but also very complicated to visualize on a 3D model in real time on a monitor. So we decided to synthesize that look into a simpler design using black line work below the eyes. It worked very well, and we were happy with the results. We were able to get something that worked in the 3D world and actually maintain some of the high detail from Jim Lee's original design, which is what we really wanted. Throughout the entire process, we were testing out different elements that the game designers had requested. For example, I was asked to try making the yin-yang symbol on Sin Tzu's forehead spin. At first, I thought this was a joke, but no, they really wanted to try it out. There were also a lot of tests done with his hands. They started off being really claw-like, but as the character evolved, the hands became more human. Then they went back to being more claw-like to help Sin Tzu retain that supernatural feel. Right now, that's what we have, and that's what should make it to the game. So the biggest part of my job was to take Jim Lee's concepts, which were very detailed, lots of shadows, very realistic, with a lot of dramatic lighting, and simplify them as much as possible to resemble the art style of Bruce Timm, the animated series look. But at the same time, the style needed to be transferable and animatable in 3D. So I also had to work with Daniel Bordelot, our 3D artist, in order to be able to integrate that in the game. So it was basically a compromise, a three-way compromise between Jim Lee, Bruce Timm's look, and the 3D requirements. Compared to the other bosses of the game, we had no reference points for Sin Tzu. We knew what the character would look like visually, but we had no idea how he would move or what his personality was. When we considered how to animate Sin Tzu, what we wanted to create was neither realistic nor cartoonish. What we were aiming for was semi-realistic, if you'll allow the expression. We referenced movements from karate, kung fu, and capoeira to give us the realistic base animations. The animation was created almost exclusively by hand. There was no motion capture involved. Then we amplified those basic movements with a hyper-real stylized look.
He had to appear extremely quick, hard to get a hold of, almost to the point of frustration. And he needed to appear extremely confident, maybe to a fault. And because basically Sin Tzu is in control. He's the master general, and he's going to dictate to Batman how the game will be played, if you will.
One of his main aspects is speed. In the fight against Batman, the final fight, the main thing you have to fight against is speed. He's always moving around. You never get a chance to hit him. You have to find the right opportunity. And that's where we had to add some more special effect, make him move very fast, and make it some kind of motion blur trail behind him. So you can still read the motion of what he's doing, because you have a long trail of it, but you still have a feeling of pure speed going on, and not knowing where he's going to be the next time you're going to try to hit him. One very good signature move he has is there's in one point to express his speed. In one point, Batman can try to grab Sin Tzu, but Sin Tzu is capable of breaking out of this grab and move around and all around and go hit him from behind before the player or Batman have even time to react.
One thing that we want to do with Sin Tzu and that he brings to the party is he has a kind of a metaphysical. It's not magical, and it's not like he got bitten by a radioactive scorpion or something. He's got a metaphysical, studied power. In some ways, not unlike Batman's own powers of concentration and intuition.
I knew that I wanted Sin Tzu to have a special attack, this special move that he would execute once he's being either taken a significant amount of damage from Batman, or he's been frustrated by Batman. Maybe Batman has totally foiled his plans, and now he's frustrated. He's going to unleash this big special attack on him as a kind of a fail-safe or a countermeasure. I knew that I wanted to do something like that. The Meta-Tzu attack that Sin Tzu has fit perfectly. Basically, when you beat on Sin Tzu enough, he basically rushes to the center of the screen and unleashes this huge wave of energy that's basically calling from within him, the Meta-Tzu that he's learned from centuries ago. And this is how we worked it into the game as a kind of his last fail-safe, last resort to take Batman down.
As for Sin Tzu's personality, we wanted him to be someone who was cultivated, elite, and arrogant.
Impressive trophy collection, is it not?
One way we conveyed this in-game was with his body language, standing defiantly in front of the player characters like Batman or Nightwing with his arms crossed, always confident. We made sure to always present Sin Tzu in this way. Very intelligent, very calculated, and above all, very dangerous. Every one of Sin Tzu's movements expresses Sin Tzu's strategic mind. When he attacks, he seeks to knock down an adversary in one shot, to not only beat him physically, but mentally as well. Working with Jim Lee was very interesting. It was great to come into work and have new sketches from Jim Lee in your mailbox. Later on, Jim did even more sketches, which was great. Some of them were more cartoonish than his usual style and helped define Sin Tzu's facial expressions. Sin Tzu gained his square jaw look from these later sketches. His eyes were defined. The character matured. Jim used Photoshop to retouch 3D images we sent him to suggest color choices, correct little details, and sometimes add new details. This really helped us to create the character that everyone wanted. Collaborating with Jim Lee was very, very interesting. It was great to work with Jim because I followed his work for a long time, and I really respect what he's done. And when I was a kid, I really loved to read DC Comics. So working with both Jim Lee and DC Comics is kind of like a childhood dream come true, but also a bit intimidating at the same time.
It was a little special to work to create this character working with people at DC and Warner. I was a little scared at the beginning that Jim Lee would give us a drawing, we just put that in 3D, and that's it. There's no way to discuss about anything. But we end up receiving many drawings from Jim Lee and asking us, what do you prefer, what is good for you, and then we end up cutting all parts, putting them together, and say, okay, we like the head of this guy, and maybe the hands of this guy, and it all was done in a team spirit, and it was very well received, and the result is very nice. So everybody feel like they put a little part of it in it, and it feels very good.
You know, when Jim Lee came on board, that's when you knew this was going to be something special, and it's an incredible opportunity and an incredible achievement on our part too, and DC's as well, to create a new villain specifically for this game that can be exploited thereafter in comics and books and whatnot, and we're contributing to the pantheon of awesome villains that exist today in the Batman mythos. You know, Batman is, I think, one of the most popular and well-known comic heroes, you know, in the last century. So yeah, it's an awesome opportunity. It's extremely inspiring and exciting for us to be working on that.
I've always been a big fan of Batman ever since I was young, so working on a Batman game was really special for me. It was very interesting working with Jim Lee and helping give life to this character. It was an honor to be a part of the team. I'm really proud of the work we've done, and I'm sure the entire team is really proud of the character we helped create. Again, this is a childhood dream to be able to work on a project like this, especially in a series that's so popular and so mythical. That meant we had to approach this project with the attitude that we couldn't mess it up. We had to do this right, for the sake of the Batman universe.
I think if you're a 10-year-old kid that's into Batman, you've been watching the Batman cartoons, picking up the Batman comic book, it's great because you're seeing a new Batman villain show up in the video game first. He'll probably appear in the comic book, he'll probably appear in other Batman-related things, but he's going to show up in this game first. And I think it's always cool to be there when it happens. You know, I remember when I saw my first, Star Wars movie or picked up my first comic book. I knew exactly, where I was, what characters were in it. And I think if you're into comics, you're into pop culture, it's a first. I mean, there's not a lot of this. Most games that are based on existing properties like Batman are pretty much adaptations of something that already exists. This is the first, or one of the first times where people that are into comics were hired to create something novel, something original for the Batman video game itself. And then and then that in itself will come back to comic books, and you'll see the Sin Tzu character appear in other versions of Batman, whether it's cartoons or comics or whatever. And I think that's a first, and I think it's exciting. I mean, from my standpoint, it's exciting, and I would think from a fan standpoint, it'd be exciting to catch, to be there for Batman history, I guess.
You made the worst mistake a general can make.
And what would that be?
You misjudged your enemy. My motives are nothing like yours.
Save a sweet victory now, or there will be another day.
Sin Tzu is the latest addition to the rich heritage of unforgettable Batman villains. But will he ever rise again to strike Gotham City? As Batman's endless battle against crime has taught us, the true depth of evil is impossible to predict. So perhaps the question isn't if Sin Tzu will return to battle Batman, but when.